It is the summer of 1944. The fields of France are still scarred from a war that has already swallowed millions of lives. Standing before a sea of young men, thousands of them, helmets gleaming, boots caked in European mud, is a figure unlike any other in the American military. Tall, ramrod straight, with two ivory-handled revolvers riding at his hips like something out of a frontier legend, General George Smith Patton Jr. raises his voice until it cuts through the morning air like a blade. "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country," he tells them. "He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his." The men erupt, not because he is comforting, not because he promises them safety, but because somewhere in that brutal honesty, they recognize something real, something no recruiting poster has ever dared to say out loud. And yet, this same man was fired, not once, not twice, but 3 times by the military he served. He was despised by some of his closest colleagues. He struck a hospitalized soldier in front of witnesses and nearly destroyed his career over it. He made enemies in Washington, enemies in Moscow, and enemies in his own command. Some of the men who served under him called him reckless, cruel, a glory hunter who spent lives like pocket change. But here is what the historians also tell us. Without George Patton, the Third Army liberated 10,000 square miles of France in less than 3 weeks, a pace of advance that military scholars still study today. Without George Patton, 20,000 American soldiers trapped in the frozen forests of Belgium would likely have perished. He turned 3 full divisions around in a single winter night, without headlights, without sleep, through roads choked with snow and ice, and broke through to Bastogne in 4 days, when every general in Europe said it was impossible. He was fired 3 times. He was also, by almost every objective measure, the most effective battlefield commander the United States produced in the Second World War. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was something far more difficult and far more interesting than either. He was a real human being. This is his story. Chapter 1. Warrior Blood. On the 11th day of November, 1885, a date that would later become Armistice Day, the day the First World War ended, George Smith Patton Jr. was born in San Gabriel, California. If you believe in omens, the timing is almost too perfect. He was born into a family where war was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a tradition to be honored. His great-grandfather, Colonel George Smith Patton of the Confederacy, had died in combat at the Battle of Cedar Creek in Virginia in 1864, charging forward, as the family story went, the way Pattons always charged. His grandfather had served as well. His father, George Smith Patton Sr., was a lawyer and a scholar, but a man thoroughly steeped in the romance of military history. He read to his children the way other fathers told bedtime stories, except his stories came from Homer, from Julius Caesar's own accounts of his Gallic campaigns, from the dispatches of Napoleon Bonaparte. Young George absorbed all of it. He absorbed it with a hunger that surprised even his father. Here is the thing that almost no one remembers about the man who would become America's most famous general. Until he was 12 years old, George Patton could not read. Not because he lacked intelligence. The boy's mind was extraordinary, but he struggled with what we now recognize as dyslexia, letters that refused to sit still on a page, words that scrambled themselves before his eyes. In a different family, in a different era, this might have ended everything before it began. Instead, it gave him something rare. Because he could not read, George Patton listened. He listened with a precision and a retention that approached the supernatural. By the time he was 10 years old, he could recite entire passages of Caesar's Gallic Wars from memory, not because he had read them, but because he had heard them, over and over, until they were carved into his mind. By 12, he was arguing with his father about the tactical decisions at the Battle of Austerlitz, dissecting Napoleon's flanking maneuver with the confidence of a cadet who had studied it for years. He had studied it, just not from books. This auditory memory would serve him for the rest of his life. When other officers consulted maps, Patton often already knew the terrain, because he had memorized descriptions of it, historical accounts, geographical studies, everything he had ever heard spoken about the land he was about to cross. There was one other thing about the young Patton that distinguished him from his peers, and it is the kind of detail that makes biographers either fascinated or uncomfortable. He believed, with complete and apparently sincere conviction, that he had lived before. Not metaphorically, not as a philosophical position. He believed that his soul had walked the earth in other bodies, in other centuries, and that those previous lives had been lives of war. He believed he had fought alongside Alexander the Great. He believed he had stood in the ranks at Carthage. He believed he had marched under the eagles of Julius Caesar. In 1943, when Patton's forces were advancing through Tunisia, through landscapes that had seen no significant military action in 1700 years, he reportedly turned to a British officer riding beside him and said, quietly, that he knew this road, that his men had marched it before. Historians debate what to make of this. What is not debatable is its effect on the man himself. Patton's belief in reincarnation, whatever its truth or falsehood, gave him something almost no soldier possesses, a complete and functional absence of fear. Not bravado, not performance. He genuinely did not appear to fear death, because he genuinely seemed to believe that death was, at worst, an intermission. That absence of fear would shape everything that followed. The road to West Point, the United States Military Academy, was not smooth. In 1903, Patton applied and failed. The mathematics examination defeated him. He spent a year at the Virginia Military Institute, grinding through the arithmetic that had always resisted him, and applied again in 1904. He was accepted. Then he was held back a year. His academic struggles in mathematics had followed him north. Here is what is remarkable. He did not quit. He did not transfer. He did not find a quieter path. He stayed, endured the humiliation of repeating a year among men younger than himself, and graduated in 1909, ranked 46th in a class of 103. Not brilliant on paper, but his instructors noticed something that the rankings could not capture. There was a quality to this man, a presence, a seriousness of purpose, that set him apart from the cadets who outranked him academically. He kept journals. He wrote poetry, rough and earnest. He studied tactics with an intensity that unnerved some of his classmates. He already knew, with the certainty of a man who has known something his entire life, exactly what he was going to do with himself. Chapter 2. From Cavalry to Iron. When Patton graduated from West Point, the United States Army still rode horses. He was assigned to the cavalry, and he took to it with the same ferocious dedication he brought to everything. But Patton was never content to simply master what was in front of him. He had to go further, go deeper, push past the edge of what was expected. Within a few years of his commission, he had become obsessed with the saber, the cavalry sword that was already, in the minds of most military planners, sliding toward obsolescence. He didn't care. He traveled to France to study fencing under masters of the craft. He redesigned the standard United States cavalry saber, creating what became known as the Patton saber, a thrusting weapon rather than a slashing one, built on principles he had studied in European fencing halls. The Army adopted his design. By the time he was 27 years old, he had been designated the Master of the Sword of the United States Army. There was exactly one person in the entire military who held that title. In 1912, He carried that intensity to Stockholm, Sweden, for the Olympic Games. Patton competed in the modern pentathlon, a grueling 5-discipline event that included shooting, fencing, swimming, riding, and a cross-country run. He was one of the finest fencers in the competition. His riding was masterful. His run was strong. But in the shooting portion, the event that should have been a formality for a trained military officer, he finished lower than expected, and the margin cost him the gold medal. He finished 5th overall. The story that spread afterward, and that Patton himself seemed to neither confirm nor deny, was that he had been penalized for shooting too accurately, that his bullets passed through the same holes in the target, so the judges could not count all 5 shots. Whether this is true or a legend that served his pride, what matters is what he did afterward. He did not rage. He did not make excuses. He sat down, analyzed his performance, and identified the specific decisions that had cost him the podium. That habit, losing, analyzing, learning, improving, would define his generalship 20 years later. In 1916, the United States Army sent a punitive expedition into Mexico, chasing the revolutionary guerrilla commander Pancho Villa, who had raided an American border town. Patton went with General John Pershing, still officially a cavalry officer, still eager for whatever action might be found. He found it at a ranch called San Miguelito. Leading a small patrol in automobiles, not horses, automobiles, Patton rode into an ambush involving some of Villa's most trusted commanders. In the firefight that followed, he killed a man named Cardenas, one of Villa's captains, and 2 other fighters. Then he did something that would be remembered for its calculated psychological theatricality. He had the bodies tied to the hoods of the automobiles and driven back to camp. The newspapers called him the Bandit Killer. Pershing called him his Bandido. But what Patton took away from the experience was something the newspapers never reported. It was not the violence. It was the vehicles. Automobiles had gotten him to that ranch faster than any horse could have. Automobiles had given him the element of surprise. Automobiles were, he began to understand, the future of everything he cared about: speed, shock, mobility. The horse, he decided quietly, was finished. By the time the United States entered the First World War and Patton crossed the Atlantic to France in 1917, the tank had made its first appearances on European battlefields. The British had used them on the Somme. The French had experimented with their own designs. The results were mixed. The machines broke down, got stuck in mud, moved too slowly, were deployed in ways that squandered their potential. Patton looked at these early tanks and saw something none of their designers seemed to fully understand yet. He saw the automobile writ large. He saw speed, shock, and deep penetration, the same principles he had been thinking about since Mexico, now clad in armor and armed with cannon. He volunteered for tank duty. He studied the machines. He interviewed French tank crews. He built the first American tank training center essentially from nothing, writing the manuals himself, designing the training programs, selecting and shaping the officers who would lead American armor into battle. At the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, the massive Allied push that helped break the German lines, Patton led tanks forward on foot. He was shot through the upper thigh. The wound was serious enough to end most men's participation in the battle. He kept commanding from the ground, propped against a shell crater, until he could no longer stand. That night, he wrote to his wife Beatrice. He told her something he had never admitted publicly and would rarely admit again. He told her he had been afraid, genuinely afraid. Not of dying, perhaps not even of dying, but of stopping, of letting the fear show in his face and watching it spread down the line like a disease. If I stopped, he wrote, they would all stop. So he didn't stop. The war ended in November of 1918. Patton was 33 years old, decorated, recognized, and then deposited into the long, slow freeze of a peacetime army that had no interest in tanks, no budget for armor, and no patience for officers who kept writing articles about mechanized warfare and getting into arguments with their superiors about the future of ground combat. For 20 years, the army largely ignored him. He kept writing. He kept reading. He read a German writer's book called Mein Kampf in the 1930s and told his colleagues, with the flat certainty of a man reading a confirmed intelligence report, that another European war was coming and that it would be worse than the last one. They told him he was being dramatic. In September of 1939, German armored divisions, organized along principles that Patton and a handful of other visionaries had been preaching for 2 decades, crossed into Poland and destroyed an entire nation in less than a month. Patton read the dispatches from Europe and wrote in his diary 2 words that contained equal parts vindication and dread. I knew. In 1941, he was given command of the 2nd Armored Division and sent to the Mojave Desert to conduct the kind of brutal, unsparing training exercises that he had been dreaming of running since the 1920s. He drove his men without mercy and without apology. He believed that the sweat spent in training was a direct substitute for the blood spent in battle. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. George Smith Patton Jr. was 56 years old. To a man who believed his soul had fought in 100 wars across 3,000 years of human history, 56 was not old age. 56 was the beginning. Chapter 3. North Africa and Sicily, From Disgrace to Glory. To understand what George Patton accomplished in North Africa in the spring of 1943, you first have to understand the depth of the hole that American arms had fallen into. February of 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The United States Army meets the Afrika Korps in open battle for the first time, and what happens next is a catastrophe so complete, so humiliating, that senior officers in Washington spend weeks trying to figure out how to explain it to the American public without destroying morale entirely. In less than 4 days of fighting, American forces suffer roughly 6,500 casualties. Nearly 200 tanks are destroyed or captured. Entire units break and run. Soldiers abandon their weapons, their vehicles, their wounded. Field commanders lose contact with their men. The Germans, under the legendary Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the general who had spent 3 years making the British look like amateurs across the length of North Africa, push through the pass with a contemptuous ease that shocks even his own staff. The message that travels back to Allied headquarters is brutal in its simplicity. American soldiers cannot fight. American officers cannot lead. The United States Army, the most lavishly equipped military force in the history of the world, does not know what it is doing. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, looks at the wreckage of the American Second Corps and makes a decision. He picks up a telephone and calls the one man in the United States Army who might be able to fix this, the one man whose methods are controversial enough, whose personality is abrasive enough, whose understanding of armored warfare is deep enough to possibly salvage something from this disaster. He calls Patton. Patton arrives in Tunisia on the 6th of March, 1943. He arrives the way he always arrived everywhere, with flags flying on his jeep, with his uniform immaculate, with his ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, with an expression on his face that communicates, without a single word being spoken, that things are about to be different. What he finds horrifies him. Not the losses. Losses in war are inevitable. What horrifies him is the slovenliness. Soldiers walking around without helmets, officers without their proper insignia, men sitting idle in clusters, hollow-eyed, defeated not by German steel, but by their own collapse of self-respect. He responds immediately. Fines for soldiers caught without helmets, fines for officers without neckties, inspections at all hours, rigid schedules, formations, salutes required and enforced. His own staff thought he had lost his mind. Men were dying, and he was issuing citations for unbuttoned collar buttons. But Patton understood something that his critics missed entirely. He understood that discipline is not a luxury you add to an effective fighting force. Discipline is the mechanism by which an ordinary man convinces himself, under conditions of genuine terror, to do what he has been trained to do instead of what his body is screaming at him to do. Discipline starts with the small things, the helmet, the tie, the salute, because if a man cannot hold to a standard when nothing is at stake, he will certainly abandon it when everything is at stake. Within days, the Second Corps begins to look different, stands taller, moves with purpose. On the 23rd of March, 1943, American forces under Patton engage German armor at El Guetar and win. Not a dramatic victory, not a rout, but a clean, disciplined, professional military victory over the same German forces that had destroyed them at Kasserine Pass 3 weeks earlier. It is the first clear American ground victory over German forces in the entire war. Patton writes in his diary that evening with characteristic economy. He does not celebrate. He notes the outcome and immediately begins thinking about what comes next. What came next was Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July of 1943, is where Patton's genius and Patton's demons begin to inhabit the same story simultaneously, where the man who will later save 20,000 soldiers at Bastogne and the man who will strike a hospitalized private in a field tent first appear side by side. The Sicilian campaign introduces the dynamic that will define Patton's war, his relationship with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. If Patton was a blade, fast, aggressive, impatient, designed to cut deep and keep moving, Montgomery was a siege engine, methodical, careful, unwilling to commit until every variable had been calculated and every supply line secured. Each man found the other's methods not merely different, but genuinely baffling. Montgomery had been assigned the primary role in Sicily, the eastern route, up toward Messina, the campaign's strategic prize. Patton's 7th Army was initially given a supporting role, protecting Montgomery's flank. Patton looked at the maps and saw an opportunity. Without waiting for authorization, a habit that would recur throughout his career, infuriating his superiors even as it produced results they could not argue with, he launched a thrust toward Palermo, the Sicilian capital, in the northwest. His forces covered 100 miles in less than 4 days. Palermo fell. The newspapers exploded with the story. Patton's face was on front pages across America. Then he turned east and raced Montgomery to Messina. He arrived 2 hours ahead of the British. 2 hours, a margin so slim it was almost symbolic. But Patton understood that symbolism, in war as in politics, is never trivial. He stood in Messina and waited for Montgomery's advance elements to arrive, greeting them with a courtesy so exaggerated it could only have been intentional. The campaign was a success. The numbers were extraordinary. But inside that success, 2 incidents had occurred that would nearly end everything. On the 3rd of August, 1943, Patton visited a field hospital and encountered a soldier named Private Charles Cool. Cool was sitting among the genuinely wounded, men with burns, men with bullet wounds, men with shrapnel in places that would pain them for the rest of their lives. Cool had no visible physical wound. When Patton asked what was wrong with him, Cool said he was nervous. that he couldn't take it anymore. Patton struck him across the face with his glove. Then he grabbed him by the collar and threw him out of the tent, screaming that he was a coward and a disgrace. 1 week later, a nearly identical incident occurred with a second soldier, Private Paul Bennett, who had been reported to the medical station suffering from what his commanding officer described as combat exhaustion. Patton struck him as well. What Patton saw in those two men was weakness, a contagious weakness that, left unchallenged, would spread through an army the way disease spreads through a body. What the doctors in those tents saw, what we now understand with a certainty that did not exist in 1943, was combat trauma. Post-traumatic stress, not cowardice, not weakness of character. A neurological injury, as real as a shrapnel wound, inflicted by sustained exposure to conditions no human nervous system was designed to endure. Patton could not see this. Whether because of the era, because of his own psychological makeup, because of the belief in reincarnation that made death seem trivial, he could not see it. He saw men quitting. And quitting, to George Patton, was the one unforgivable act. The incidents were reported. Correspondent Drew Pearson broke the story in November of 1943, and the American public erupted. Congressional calls for Patton's dismissal, editorials demanding accountability, letters to the War Department by the thousands. Eisenhower ordered Patton to publicly apologize to both soldiers, to their units, and to every hospital in the 7th Army. Patton did it. He stood before his men and delivered an apology that witnesses described as technically correct in its wording and completely unconvincing in its delivery. The apology of a man who understood that words were required but remained certain, somewhere beneath them, that he had not been wrong. He was removed from operational command. While Allied planners worked through the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, on the most complex military operation in human history, the liberation of Western Europe, George Patton sat in a villa in Sicily, reading history, writing in his diary, watching the war happen without him. He wrote on one of those idle days that there was no punishment worse than being forced to sit still while others went to fight. What he did not know, what very few people knew, was that Washington had not finished with him. Not by a considerable distance. Chapter 4. Operation Fortitude. A weapon made of illusion. The fundamental problem facing the Allied planners of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was not logistics, although the logistics were staggering. It was not firepower, although the firepower required was unprecedented. The fundamental problem was geography. The English Channel narrows to its minimum width at the Strait of Dover, the Pas de Calais. Every military mind in Europe, German and Allied alike, understood that the most logical invasion point was the Pas de Calais. Shorter crossing, better port infrastructure, more direct route into the German heartland. The Germans had fortified it accordingly. 15 elite divisions waited there, behind the Atlantic Wall, under the command of some of Germany's finest officers. The actual invasion was planned for Normandy, farther west, less obvious, and for that reason, hopefully less expected. But hoping the Germans would be looking the wrong way was not a plan. The Allied intelligence services needed something more reliable than hope. They needed the Germans to be certain, absolutely, committedly certain, that the main blow was coming at the Pas de Calais, and they needed that certainty to hold even after the Normandy landings began, so that the critical German reserves would not be redirected south until it was too late. They needed a ghost army. And for the ghost army to be convincing, it needed a ghost commander, someone whose reputation was so formidable, whose known methods were so aligned with a massive armored thrust across the narrowest part of the channel, that the German High Command would look at the evidence and draw exactly the conclusion the Allies wanted them to draw. There was only one candidate. George Smith Patton Jr. was appointed nominal commander of the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a force that existed primarily in radio transmissions, in the reports of German double agents who had been secretly turned by British intelligence, and in the carefully staged public appearances of one very recognizable general. The operation was called Fortitude. The British intelligence service, MI5, had spent years constructing a network of German agents operating in Britain who were, in reality, fully controlled by the British. Every piece of intelligence these agents transmitted to Berlin was crafted by Allied planners to reinforce a single narrative: that the real invasion force was assembling in the southeast of England under the command of General Patton, pointing directly at the Pas de Calais. Fake radio traffic, false supply dumps, inflatable rubber tanks photographed from sufficient altitude to fool German aerial reconnaissance. And throughout it all, the real and verifiable presence of Patton himself, appearing at events in the southeast of England, being seen, being reported on, being logged in German intelligence summaries as the obvious commander of the obvious main effort. Adolf Hitler believed it. His intelligence services believed it. The German High Command believed it so thoroughly that they constructed their entire defensive strategy around it. Then, in April of 1944, with the invasion just weeks away, Patton nearly destroyed everything with a single sentence. He had been invited to speak at the opening of a servicemen's club in a small English town called Knutsford. The event was supposed to be private, off the record, casual. Patton, in the easy confidence of a man who had been speaking to crowds his entire life, made an offhand remark about how the British and Americans were destined to rule the post-war world together. He did not mention the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1944, the Soviet Union had already lost more than 20 million people fighting a war that Germany could not have continued without the Eastern Front absorbing the overwhelming majority of German military power. The omission was not small. Moscow protested officially. American senators who had been looking for an excuse to demand Patton's head found one. The calls for his dismissal reached a pitch that was genuinely threatening. Eisenhower wrote him a letter that those who have read it describe as the most controlled expression of fury they have ever encountered in a military document. He told Patton that he had reached the end of his patience. That one more incident, one more speech, one more improvised comment, one more moment of self-destructive theater, and it would be finished, regardless of the military consequences. Then, Eisenhower kept him in command of FUSAG, because the alternative was unthinkable. Replacing Patton with anyone else would have immediately signaled to German intelligence that the entire FUSAG operation was a fabrication. The deception required Patton specifically. His reputation was the weapon. His presence was the lie that had to be maintained. And so George Patton spent the spring and early summer of 1944 being one of the most strategically valuable soldiers in the Allied order of battle, by doing absolutely nothing. On the 6th of June, 1944, he sat in England and listened to radio reports of the Normandy landings. He wrote in his diary that it was awful to sit and wait, that he had never been good at waiting, that the waiting was, in its own way, a form of torture. For 6 weeks after the Normandy landings, as Allied forces fought and bled and struggled to break out from the beachhead, Adolf Hitler refused to release the reserves waiting at the Pas de Calais. His intelligence reports continued to insist that the Normandy operation was a feint, a distraction designed to draw his attention away from the real blow that Patton would deliver across the Strait of Dover. 19 elite German divisions sat idle in northeast France, waiting for an attack that was never coming. Historians who have studied the Normandy campaign have calculated that the presence of even a portion of those reserves at the beachhead in the first weeks of the invasion could have produced catastrophically different results. The margin of Allied survival in those early days was narrow enough that the addition of fresh, rested, elite armored formations might well have been decisive. Operation Fortitude, and the Ghost General at its center, may have saved the invasion. On the 1st of August, 1944, the 3rd United States Army was officially activated. Its commander was Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. He wrote in his diary that he had waited 35 years for this. Chapter 5. The Third Army, the Summit of Genius. If you want to understand what made George Patton different from every other general in the Western Allied order of battle, you need to understand one word: tempo. Not firepower, not numbers, not logistics, though he understood logistics with a precision that would surprise people who thought of him only as a cavalry charge. Tempo, the speed at which operations unfold, the rate at which decisions are made and executed, the pace at which an enemy is given problems faster than he can solve them. Patton believed, with the conviction of a man who had studied 3,000 years of military history, that speed was not merely an advantage in war. Speed was the fundamental variable. A slower force with superior numbers and firepower could be defeated by a faster force, repeatedly, reliably, predictably, because speed meant that the faster commander was always acting on yesterday's reality, while the enemy was still trying to understand today's. In 3 weeks following the activation of the Third Army in August of 1944, Patton's forces liberated 10,000 square miles of French territory. The advance moved so fast that it outpaced its own supply lines. His tanks began stopping not because of German resistance, but because they had literally run out of fuel, racing so far ahead of the logistics chain that the trucks couldn't keep up. He built his command around 3 principles that were radical departures from conventional military thinking of the era. Speed decided everything, not when conditions were perfect, but especially when conditions were not perfect, because imperfect conditions hurt slower enemies more than they hurt faster ones. Command had to be radically decentralized. Patton told his subordinate commanders what he needed achieved, not how to achieve it. In an era when most senior generals sent detailed, specific orders and expected them to be followed to the letter, Patton sent objectives and trusted his officers to find their own way to them. This meant that even when communications broke down, as they constantly did in fluid offensive operations, his army kept moving, because every commander at every level already knew the intent, and Patton commanded from the front. Not from a distant headquarters, surrounded by maps and telephones and the comfortable illusion of control. His jeep was frequently close enough to the fighting that his staff officers lived in a state of low-grade terror. He believed that a general's physical presence on the battlefield, his 3-star flags visible to the men in the forward positions, communicated something no radio message could, that whoever was asking them to do this dangerous thing was willing to share the danger. In August of 1944, the opportunity arose to possibly end the war months early. German forces in Normandy were caught in a pocket near the town of Falaise, a pocket that, if closed completely, would have trapped and destroyed the bulk of the German army in the west. Patton saw the geometry clearly and moved his forces to close it. He was ordered to stop by General Omar Bradley. The reasons were complicated: concerns about Allied forces firing on each other, concerns about Montgomery's slower-moving forces being unable to close their side of the pocket in time. Between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers escaped through the gap that was never closed. Among military historians, the Falaise Gap remains one of the most debated decisions of the Western campaign. Among Patton's biographers, it represents the clearest example of what he cost the Allies when his superiors constrained him. He bypassed Paris deliberately, understanding that a city of that size would consume his momentum and his supplies for days, accomplishing nothing militarily that its own liberation by French forces could not accomplish, and kept driving east. Then, in September, Eisenhower made a decision that Patton believed was a strategic error of the first magnitude. Faced with a fuel shortage that could not supply all of his advancing armies simultaneously, the Supreme Commander shifted priority to Montgomery's northern thrust toward the Rhine. Operation Market Garden. Patton's Third Army was halted. His tanks sat motionless, while fuel that he believed would have carried him to the German border went north instead. Market Garden ended in a costly failure at Arnhem. Patton's army sat still and waited. Then December arrived, and with it, the greatest crisis of the Western campaign. On the 16th of December, 1944, Hitler launched his final strategic gamble in the West, a massive armored counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest of Belgium, targeting the port of Antwerp. The attack struck at the weakest point in the Allied line, achieved complete tactical surprise, and within days had created a massive bulge in the Allied front, the engagement that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. At the tip of the deepest German penetration, in the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne, the American 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, cut off, outnumbered, running short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The temperature was dropping toward the coldest winter Europe had experienced in decades. Eisenhower convened an emergency conference of his senior commanders on the 19th of December. He turned to Patton and asked how quickly the Third Army could wheel north and attack to relieve Bastogne. Patton said 4 days. The room went quiet. A general does not simply turn an army. An army is not a car. It is hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, artillery, supply trains, communication networks, all oriented in a specific direction, all tied into a logistical system built for operations in a specific axis. Turning it 90 degrees, in winter, in 4 days, had never been done. Most of the commanders in that room believed it could not be done. What none of them knew, except for the small circle of officers Patton had brought into his confidence, was that Patton had anticipated the German offensive. He had been watching the intelligence reports. He had sensed, with the instinct of a man who had been studying military history since childhood, that something was coming. And so, quietly, without authorization, without telling his superiors, he had already prepared 3 contingency plans for a rapid reorientation of his forces northward. His staff had already war-gamed the routes, identified the logistics nodes, calculated the fuel requirements. When Eisenhower asked for 4 days, Patton was not guessing. He was reporting. On the night of the 20th of December, 3 full divisions of the Third Army turned north. They moved without headlights through roads packed with ice and snow, through temperatures that cracked engine blocks and froze fuel lines, past the refugees and the stragglers, and the wreckage of units that had been hit by the German advance. They moved in darkness because lights would have revealed them to German aircraft and to German observers on the high ground. On the 26th of December, 1944, 6 days after that emergency conference, 4 days after the official order, the 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. A soldier who was among the besieged 101st Airborne said afterward, years later, that he had known Patton was coming because the word had passed through the frozen foxholes like something alive, and that even men who had spent the previous week cursing the general's name, cursing his recklessness and his vanity and his demands, felt something they had not felt for days when that news arrived. They felt safe. Patton wrote in his diary on the 26th of December that it was the best day of his life. He did not slow down. In the spring of 1945, he reached the Rhine, the great river that for centuries had represented the physical boundary of Germany, the last significant natural barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. Montgomery had been planning a massive, elaborately staged set-piece crossing with full air support, naval gunfire coordination, and an airborne operation, a crossing that would be announced to the world as a historic achievement. Patton crossed the Rhine on the 22nd of March, a day before Montgomery's operation began, with a relatively modest bridging operation that his engineers threw together in hours rather than weeks. As he reached the eastern bank, he paused in the middle of his crossing, turned toward the river, and spat into it. He had been waiting to do that since the autumn of 1944. In April of 1945, as his army drove deeper into Germany and the war contracted toward its final act, Patton's forces came upon a concentration camp near the German town of Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, one of the first of the Nazi extermination facilities to be encountered by American forces. Patton had seen everything a battlefield had to offer. He had commanded men in combat for nearly 3 decades. He had visited field hospitals full of catastrophically wounded soldiers. He had seen what artillery did to human beings at close range, and he had kept his composure through all of it. He walked into Ohrdruf on the 4th of April, 1945, and lost it completely. He ordered the German civilian population of the surrounding area brought to the camp. He made them walk through it. He made them see what had been done, what had been permitted, what had been happening for years, while they went about their ordinary lives in the ordinary towns a few kilometers away. He was not composed while he gave these orders. 3 weeks later, on the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered. Patton sat in his headquarters and listened to the announcement. Then he wrote in his diary a sentence that his biographers have returned to again and again in the 80 years since, a sentence that reads now like a prophecy, or a confession, or both. We have defeated the wrong enemy. The war was over. George Patton was 59 years old, and he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Chapter 6. The Shadow Behind the Glory. There is a particular kind of tragedy reserved for men who are built entirely for one purpose. A sword is a magnificent instrument in battle. In a dining room, it is just a dangerous inconvenience. When the guns fell silent in May of 1945, George Patton found himself in exactly that position, a weapon without a war, a man whose every instinct, every skill, every habit of mind had been forged in conditions that no longer existed. The Third Army was being demobilized around him. The soldiers he had driven across France and into the heart of Germany were going home, back to the farms and the factories and the colleges they had left, back to the lives the war had interrupted. Patton had no life to go back to. He had only ever had the one. Eisenhower appointed him military governor of Bavaria. On paper, a position of enormous responsibility. In practice, it required exactly the skills Patton had never developed and never needed: administration, patience, political nuance, the ability to negotiate with people he despised. He was catastrophically unsuited for it. The central task facing every Allied military governor was denazification, the systematic removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of authority. Patton began appointing former party members to administrative roles because they were, in his assessment, the most competent people available. His reasoning had a certain ruthless logic. But in the summer of 1945, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, it was an act of staggering moral blindness. Then came the press conference of the 22nd of September, 1945. A journalist asked Patton to justify his policy. Patton said that the Nazi thing was just like a political party back home. That membership was not so different from being a Republican or a Democrat. The words went out over the wire services before anyone could stop them. 6 million Jews, the camps, the Nuremberg trials being organized. And one of America's most famous generals had just compared the Nazi Party to a domestic political organization. Eisenhower relieved him of command within days, transferring him to a paper formation whose sole function was compiling historical records. Patton understood perfectly what it was. Honesty requires going further. The denazification scandal was not an isolated lapse. His private diaries from the post-war months contain passages about Jewish survivors in the displaced persons camps that are not simply insensitive. They reflect a prejudice that cannot be explained away. These passages exist. They are in the historical record. They cannot be softened. What makes them particularly difficult is that they coexist in the same man with evidence of genuine humanity. Patton wept privately for his dead. Commanders described finding him alone in military cemeteries, walking among the graves, reading names from the markers, not performing, not being observed, simply honoring the men whose deaths he had ordered. He wrote to his wife Beatrice with a tenderness completely invisible to the officers who faced him in briefing rooms. His faith was genuine. In December of 1944, with his army stalled in the Ardennes and bad weather grounding Allied aircraft, Patton asked his chaplain to write a prayer for clear skies. He had 250,000 copies printed and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. On the 23rd of December, the clouds broke. The skies cleared. Whether answered prayer or meteorological coincidence, Patton believed it was the former, with apparently complete sincerity. In the summer of 1945, watching the Soviet Union consolidate control over Eastern Europe, he made statements, in his diary, in private conversations, that the United States had made a fundamental strategic error. He believed the Soviets represented the true long-term threat, and that the Allied armies, still at peak strength in Europe, should address it immediately. He was not wrong about the diagnosis. The Cold War validated it. His proposed remedy, initiating military operations against a formal ally that had just lost more than 20 million people, would have been catastrophic. Right about the problem, disastrously wrong about the solution. In October of 1945, the Third Army was officially deactivated. Patton attended the ceremony. His staff described his face as the face of a man watching something die. He was 60 years old. He did not know who he was without it. Chapter 7. The Mysterious Death and the Questions That Remain. December of 1945. Germany. On the morning of the 9th of December, Patton is in Mannheim, preparing for what may be a permanent return to the United States. He goes on a pheasant hunt with his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay. At approximately 11:45, the staff car is struck by a 2.5-ton army truck that turns across the road at an intersection near Kiefertal. The collision is not catastrophic by physical evidence. The vehicles are traveling slowly. The damage is moderate. General Gay is not seriously injured. The driver is not seriously injured. Patton is thrown forward. By the time the car stops, he cannot feel his arms or his legs. Fractured third and fourth cervical vertebrae. Complete paralysis below the neck. His mind is entirely clear. In the ambulance to Heidelberg, he tells the medics it is a hell of a way to die. Beatrice flies to Germany. For 12 days she reads to him poetry, military history, letters from veterans of the Third Army. Those who saw them together described something at odds with every public image of the general. A man and a woman of more than 30 years of marriage, talking quietly, and between them an obvious and complete tenderness. On the morning of the 21st of December, 1945, Beatrice arrived at the hospital to find that her husband had died in the night. The cause of death was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled from his immobile legs to his lungs. He was 60 years old. Pulmonary embolism in a completely paralyzed patient in 1945, before modern anticoagulant therapy, is medically entirely plausible. It was a common cause of death in paralyzed patients of that era. This is what the historical and medical record supports. And yet, the questions have never entirely gone away. They have never gone away because of the timing. Patton, in December of 1945, was a man making powerful enemies in both Washington and Moscow. His statements about the Soviet Union had been noticed. His desire to remain active, to advocate loudly for policies deeply inconvenient to multiple governments, this was known. The truck driver was never court-martialed. The accident investigation was conducted with a briskness that left questions unanswered. Decades later, a former intelligence officer published claims that the accident had been staged and that Patton had been murdered in the hospital. Here is what honesty requires. There is no declassified document, no verified intelligence record, no court-admissible evidence supporting the murder theory. The most specific version rests on a single uncorroborated source. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is not evidence of presence either. What we can say is this: Patton died at the moment he was most inconvenient to powerful people in multiple countries. The accident that paralyzed him was modest in its physical violence. The investigation was not exhaustive. And the man most likely to make noise about the emerging post-war order, who had demonstrated, repeatedly and spectacularly, that he had no capacity for silence, was dead within 12 days. Whether this is murder, coincidence, or simply history's particular cruelty toward its most dramatic figures, we do not know. The witnesses are gone. The truth, if there is a single truth, is not available to us. Closing reflection. A veteran quoted in a newspaper in January of 1946 said it this way: "I hated him every day I served under him, and I am alive because of him. And I honestly do not know what to do with that. That tension does not resolve. Both things are true simultaneously." The man who saved you and the man who treated you as a means to an end were the same man. Choosing one and discarding the other does a disservice to what George Patton actually was. He was buried, at his own request, in Luxembourg, in the military cemetery at Ham, among the soldiers of the Third Army. His grave looks like the graves around it, the same white cross, slightly apart, but among them. Slightly apart from the men around him, in his intensity, his certainty, his cruelty, and his compassion, and his brilliant, relentless refusal to accept the pace at which other men thought war could be conducted, but always among them. Greatness, the story of George Patton suggests, does not require perfection. The people who actually change the trajectory of events, who appear when the outcome is genuinely uncertain and tip the balance, are not the people without flaws. They are the people who keep moving despite them. He kept moving. Through the desert of Mexico and the mud of France and the sands of North Africa and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Through the firings, the scandals, the humiliations. Through the dyslexia, the belief in reincarnation, the absolute and sometimes terrible conviction that speed and will and the refusal to stop were the only things that ultimately decided anything. He kept moving until he could not. He is buried in Luxembourg. The man beneath that marker, with all his gifts and all his failures, all his brilliance and all his blindness, helped determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. Not in spite of being human, because of it.